folks. This is Dr. Emily Scherning with American Resiliency. I'm here with an up-to-date climate outlook for all of our friends in Texas. Texas, I know you all are in it. If you hang out on this channel, you know we're currently at 1.5 C over pre-industrial baseline. We just got the May numbers from the Copernicus Institute. May of 2024 came in at 1.52 C over pre-industrial baseline. So we've been at or above 1.5 C for quite a while now. We're in a really serious and unexpected situation. Primary source material that I use for these outlooks is the 5th National Climate Assessment. We got an update for that in November of 23. If you want to follow along with me on the figures, you can go here to chapters and down to all figures. And you'll see the predictions for Texas at 1.5 C were not good. So it shouldn't shock us that as we look to what the experts are predicting at 2C for Texas, it's looking to go from bad to worse. We're going to be encountering more types of emerging and worsening threats in this Texas outlook than I expect to find in any other state. You know, this isn't a large YouTube channel. If you're watching this video in Texas, you're about to learn more information than the vast majority of people in Texas currently know about your state's future. I know a lot of people in Texas love Texas the way I love Iowa. I love Iowa like I want to die here. But let me tell you, it's a different world preparing for 2C in Iowa than it is in Texas. If you're making your stand in Texas, I want to get you the best intel that I can. The emerging heat threats in Texas are so serious that if I was going to be showing you them in the NCA5 climate atlas, we would have to look at a lot of different maps. So we're fortunate that we have this AR tool, which was developed by a volunteer in Texas, by Dustin in Texas, that helps us to understand the threats that are coming for Texas at 2C. As I go through this, looking at both hot days and wet bulb temperature risk levels, you should know it's powered by the identical data sets from the NCA5. It's just a little bit more user-friendly. You'll be able to pan over your county and get at-a-glance information. This link will be in the video description. Here at American Resiliency, we're passionate about making sure that you have the best, clearest possible access to the information in the NCA5. Because that federal report, your tax dollars paid for the development and review of that document, and you deserve access. But as a matter of congressional mandate, there's no direct federal funding for communication to the public about the National Climate Assessment. That made me so mad I founded American Resiliency in 2021. We're the only nonprofit focused on communicating this important information to the public, and we run on your donations. Thanks for sticking through the preamble. Let's get over to our first figure, 1.14. Looking at this figure, which is the national overview for changes at 2C, you can see that Texas is looking at 3 to 5 degrees F of total warming throughout the year at 2C above pre-industrial baseline. But to me, those numbers, 3 to 5 F, that's not intuitive to me when I think about change. And to think about the changes coming to the Texas Gulf Coast as mild as indicated on this figure, that would not be a wise way to look at it. So let's jump over to figure 2.11 and start talking about the changes to seasonal extremes in Texas. So this is a big figure here, but just at a glance, the first thing that I notice is that we're looking at a unique color here in Texas, at the changes to warm nights. A little bit of it in Alabama, little tiny bit of it in South Georgia, but mostly it's on you. And look, yes, at the heart of it, you do have a special color, and that's always a bad sign when they have to make a special color for you. Across Texas, you're looking at more than an additional month of nights over 70 across almost the entire state. Everywhere we're talking about this light red or darker, that's more than a month. As we get into this bruise color here, that's more than 2 months of additional nights over 70. Nights where it's really not cooling down enough for you to rely on passive natural cooling. It's going to be hot at night. Your air conditioning demands are going to be going up. Even Houston, where we used to get some cooling from the Gulf, we're looking at a month of additional warm nights. Across the Fort Worth area, Dallas-Fort Worth area, you can see that there's a little bit of a patch that's marginally cooler remaining with maybe 3 weeks of warm nights, but most of the area, it's a month. More than a month over here by El Paso. And in the Austin, San Antonio area, we're seeing some real signs of heat up, of definitely more than a month of warm nights coming to that area. So that stinks, but let's see what's going on with that compared to the daytime heat up. For a lot of states talking about hot days, I would just zoom back out here to the full view of figure 2.11 and start going with this change in number of days at or above 95 degrees. But this is a misleading legend here in this NCA5 figure. This figure does not actually stack your days over 100. They hide that in a separate data set, or your days over 105. Also in a separate data set. So that's why we're going to go over to the AR resources and look at your actual total increase in hot days in Texas. So in this visualization here over in Dustin's Toolset, we're able to look at the actual total additional days over 95 projected at 1.5C, where we are now. Everyone remembers last summer was pretty intense. We're going to get another one this year starting earlier. And at 2C, a close enough place in the warming pathway where it seems likely the projections are going to be pretty valid. You can see here that the colors don't change too much, but check it out. Look, the key changes. We're down in the south of Texas. We were looking at like a 2-month increase to the hot season at 1.5C. Now we're facing a 3-month increase to the hot season. And let's zoom in here a little bit. Start looking at some of our overall daytime heating expected at 2C for Texas. You can see that El Paso County, we're looking at almost 69 days, additional days over 95, alongside that more than a month of increased nighttime warming. In Dallas County and the surrounding area, we're looking at about a 2-month additional days over 95. If you're in Houston, you might have been soothed by this lighter color in Harris County, but it's still bad. 47 additional days over 95 expected a year. And that's on top of your existing over 95 hot season. So throughout Texas, you can see it's getting really hot. The projections for Texas are more dramatic and extreme than basically anywhere else in the nation. It's neck and neck, you and Arizona. And folks, in Texas, I don't want to talk to you like y'all aren't used to a little bit of heat. But when we're talking about the projections at 2C, I think it's really important to highlight the increased duration of wet bulb temperature risk. So that's when it's so hot and so humid that it can really impact your health, that it can cause more people to die on a population level. And you can see here that at 1.5C, down in the south of Texas, as everyone knows from last summer, the heat became really unusual. And when we're looking out to 2C, most of Texas has some of the largest increase in duration of wet bulb temperature risks of the entire nation. We're talking about, for most of the state, an additional 4+ weeks of conditions where the heat will be potentially life-threatening. Let's take a little step away from the heat, talk about the cold now. And I know you know as well as I do that when we're going to talk about a warming trend in Texas winters, that doesn't mean you aren't going to get freak cold snaps like you did in 2021. And you can actually see pretty clearly in the figures the potential for continued winter cold snaps as we move towards 2C. Let's check it out. Back in figure 2.11, you can see that Texas has relatively little cold loss projected at 2C compared to much of the rest of the nation. Only a handful of days lost of cold in the southern parts of Texas. That's cold duration. Talking about changes in cold intensity, for that I look at figure 11.3 from the NCA5. And I'm going to go to a zoom in just on Texas in a minute here, but you can see where I'm taking the snips from our present day climate normals in terms of winter lows, the mid-century projection, which is equivalent to about 2C. I think it's nice to know that 3C data is also readily available in the NCA5, although that's farther out. So we have a little lower certainty about if that's going to be accurate or not. So looking at these snips here from 11.3 at contemporary and projected 2C winter low conditions, I think it's worth noting that much of the nation, we're looking at a 10-degree lift in winter lows, but in Texas, it's less than that. It's more like a 5-degree lift. And you can see that in many parts of the state, there's actually no change in your winter lows projected. So when we saw that 3 to 5 degrees F of expected warming over the year, now we can see that that is basically hitting Texas entirely in the summer. Almost no change in the winter compared to the national change landscape, but huge summer change. This also means that, well, you're heating up very seriously in the summer with projected increased strain to your grid. Your winters are projected to remain entirely cold enough for serious, vicious cold snaps to remain a distinct possibility at 2C. Let's talk about the water situation. As you can see here in figure 210, which gives projected precipitation changes at different levels of global warming, where we have started to see that drought trend in Texas now. It's worth noting that as we move towards 2C, if this isn't crosshatched, if it doesn't have those little lines, it means that there's no statistical significance. So this little bit of blue banding over Texas, I'm skeptical of it. Let's go over to 4.3 and take another view. All right, here in figure 4.3, looking towards 2C, you can see that there are a few parts of Texas that might be gaining a tiny bit more precipitation which could help even out some of that extreme heat in some areas in terms of impacts towards vegetation on the ground. But most of the state is looking at a water deficit in combination with that heating trend. You can see that much of the state, you're going to be losing at least a little bit of water in inches over the course of the year. Some of the state towards the Gulf here, real deficits in precipitation, also noteworthy in the Panhandle where water is already such a challenge. So this stinks. I'm really sorry, Texas, to be giving you this bad news. You're just getting hit every way. It's going to get hotter and drier in the state, and it's going to feel drier than you might think, even in areas where there's some hope of a little bit more rain because of the increased hot season. This is a very serious outlook for your state. This drought trend outlook for the overall precipitation is a real stacker on top of that increased heat. Let's look now at the signal for extreme storms, for deluge type storms. I know you've been seeing bad ones already at 1.5. Figure 2.12 here is where I look for our extreme storm signals. And what I look for in this complex figure, I look for conserved patterns across these three subfigures. And I'm sorry to say that in Texas, we do see good conservation in these very intense storm hotspots, some of the most intense in the nation. Up in the Panhandle there, it looks like when it rains, it's going to pour with as much as 20% more rain per storm. And I'm even more concerned about this storm pattern, which is going to be falling over the Dallas-Fort Worth area pretty closely. Zooming in a little bit further, this storm signal falling over kind of the Houston-y area is not as conserved, but it's still pretty strong. It is very unfortunate that we are seeing these hot spots for extreme precipitation that are in concert with some of your more populated areas. If we zoom out a little bit, you can see that there are other areas with these sort of conserved, pretty intense precipitation, deluge type hotspots in Alabama, here at the border between Wisconsin and Illinois. But these areas aren't seeing the sort of cascading stacked threat level that you are facing in Texas. This is a uniquely difficult situation you're looking at. And unfortunately, we do have to keep pumping up that jam as we look at hurricanes. We're looking back at the NCA4 here. This is page 1492 in a PDF viewer of the NCA4. So this is a figure from like 2018, but I haven't seen a clearer consensus figure showing how hurricane tracks are likely to change. And you can see here, you're not at the heart of this projected shift. You can see that South Florida is kind of at the heart of this projected shift of increased hurricane paths. And we do see some indicator that more hurricanes are going to be crossing overland into the southeast here. In Texas, you're not looking to get directly whacked, but the storms that are coming at you in both of these models, as we look for how tracks may change, look extremely strong. Like everything that's coming towards Houston is going to be Cat 4 plus. So that implies a need for a very high level of resilience against storm winds, which, I mean, from this angle, from a hurricane angle, as well as from what we saw back in 2.12, it's very concerning. So now, as we move towards talking about sea level rise, it's worth noting, if we are in a high sea level rise scenario where we're facing the reality of potentially seeing AMOC collapse in our lifetimes and big changes to Earth's ocean currents, we're also probably talking about worse hurricanes. If you search on my channel for AMOC, you'll be able to get to this video, second from the top, which has a link in the video description for a paper showing for how we expect hurricane patterns to change. They look like in the case of AMOC collapse, we would see near-term intensification of hurricane signal in the Gulf. But focusing on sea level rise, let's get over to the NOAA sea level rise viewer. We're going to model 3 feet and 10 feet, and I think that we need to take 10 feet seriously, unfortunately, because all the info coming in from Antarctica, we do look like we're probably in a higher end rise scenario. Last year was really dramatically bad for Antarctic sea ice. There's more and more evidence coming in. We really didn't understand how fast that ice was going to melt. So let's get in here. We're going to look at Port Aransas and Corpus Christi first. At 3 feet of sea level rise, you can see that the damage around Port Aransas is pretty significant, where you start to see a fair amount of loss to developed areas, but that at 10 feet, we'd be looking at really a total inundation of this whole beautiful community. Moving inland, though, you can see that at 3 feet, the damage to Ingleside, Aransas Pass, and Corpus Christi is not as dramatic. And even at 10 feet, relatively little of the developed area around Corpus Christi is inundated. So there are some areas with very variable outcomes for sea level rise. It's worth entering your address into this tool, which is in the video descriptor, and seeing how the places that you care about would be impacted in these different rise scenarios. Corpus Christi to me looks like you could have a definite core that could build resilience where people could remain in place. So I'm zoomed out. I'm kind of working my way over to Galveston, looking at 10 feet of sea level rise. And I feel like it's worth zooming in for a minute here. Nuclear power plant lake. That seems like a thing we probably don't want the ocean to touch, right? Today, with the mean higher high water mark, this thing is pretty far inland. You can see that at 3 feet, not such a big deal. But if we get 10 plus feet of rise, that's going to start to touch nuclear power plant lake. I feel like this is a potential threat. It's worth highlighting in this video. Moving up by Galveston, and I know that this is a place that has faced enormous environmental threats before, that Galveston has rebuilt from terrible hurricanes before, but I feel like you got to know what you're up against. At 3 feet, which is kind of the best we're likely to get, we're not going to see less than 3 feet of rise in the Gulf. You can see that there's a lot of land loss in this area, and that in Galveston, we are expecting to see both rise in the water table, where we got this sort of green marshy areas, and a lot of direct inundation. And at 10 feet, we're basically losing the whole city. It's a terrible thing to see. It's very serious. Just like what we saw with Port Aransas and Corpus Christi, once you get over to the mainland, there are some areas with more potential for building resilience around a new core. But this is quite tragic for Galveston. If you're in Galveston, this is an outlook where if you're seeing this, please take it seriously. Your city is very beautiful, and it's going to be gone unless you do something crazy like build a seawall. The sea level rise is going to overtop Galveston. Let's look in here at Houston. Going from today to 3 feet over Houston, we can see that Houston is going to change, that these rivers are going to be reaching further into the city than they ever have before. And if we go to 10 feet, we'll see that in new neighborhoods, and we'll see changes to the water table. We can see that hinted at by these increased marshy areas where there may be impacts on utilities beyond directly, is the river coming to my house? This is another situation where, let's say you're over here by this beautiful, important medical center area over by the zoo over in Houston. If we see a 10 feet of sea level rise, we're going to have a higher level of water in this canal system all the time. We're going to have a higher level of water threatening this precious medical complex all the time. Just showing you one more thing here. I know there's a lot of other bird people on the channel. At 3 feet and at 10 feet, you can see the extent of wildlife habitat and agricultural areas being lost is just very painful as we move from Texas and into Louisiana. This is very serious, and it should put up a call to people who care about conservation that these areas here, we're going to really want to see more protection for these areas that will become marginal, so that we can get some conservation and some species preservation going on in these emerging marshlands under a high sea level rise situation. Talking about property damage, though, the most conservative estimates for the value of damaged and lost property by 3 feet of sea level rise on the Texas Gulf Coast is $300 billion with a B dollars. So folks, this is not a tomorrow problem, and it's not a problem someone's going to solve for you. If you're in these impacted areas and you want to preserve what your family currently has in your home in terms of the value of your home, you should sell as soon as you can. If you love the coast, if you want to stay on a warm coast, I would recommend the southern East Coast. North Carolina to Georgia on the Atlantic coast, you got some of your most stable coasts there and a high-end rise scenario. So you got to imagine that there's still change, but they're looking much more stable than Texas in terms of your total land loss. And the overall climate outlook for those states are much milder than what we see in Texas. Let's check on your wildfire outlook. Here we're over in figure 7.4 from the NCA5, and we can see about a 50% increase in fire risk for most of the model parts of Texas. There's close to a doubling of risk in the darker shaded areas of Texas. You can see your increased risk here isn't as high as in some parts of the nation, like look up at poor northern Minnesota there. But that doesn't mean it's not a serious risk. That wildfire that got out of control in Texas this spring, the area that fire burnt was incredible and really damaging to communities there. The wide-ranging wildfires that we could see in Texas, we have to keep an eye on them as an increased threat in these difficult times. Texas, I'm sorry, because this is a terrible outlook. There are other places where we can see rough roads ahead, and I spend a lot of time fretting over the emotional tone. I mean, if you saw the Oregon video, you can see that I tried to be really careful with people's feelings in Oregon, because that and a lot of other places, I'm telling folks that something they imagined was safe doesn't look so safe as we move towards 2C. But there's no imagining in Texas. People who are paying attention in Texas, they're already seeing the change. We're at 1.5, and Texas is the first place we see and where we'd expect to be seeing these extreme hot season change conditions, and they look to be quite widespread by the time we hit 2C above baseline in Texas. You know, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm sorry if just giving it to you straight if that's hurting anyone, if you'd like a softer touch. But I think I understand what many people in Texas want to hear, and I think that's the truth. So I'm trying to tell you that as best I can and as clear as I can. Because in conditions of hardship and change like what you're facing, the kind of intense change Texas is already experiencing, I think it's worth showing again. Texas is at the core of our projected national change. Texas is facing some of the biggest hits in the nation. You're at the core of our current experience change too. People who are experiencing that kind of hardship and change, in my experience, it tends to make people want something hard and clean, even if it hurts. You want to get it clean. And if you're making your stand in Texas, you need this clear information because you're going to have to be next level. Water storage is going to be your first crux. It's absolutely critical. The next hold is going to be building heat resilience. You should consider a mixture of passive and active heat solutions, solutions that'll help you stay cool with or without power. And after that, if I were you, I'd consider your energy inputs. Power for sure, and energy for humans, like food, because your grid isn't strong. And I don't think it's going to get tough fast enough for what's coming. So power independence matters for your household. And you know as well as I do that if the grid goes down, the supply chain is going to get all messed up, and then food becomes a problem pretty quick. I am most concerned about supply chain issues in Texas than anywhere else in the lower 48 because of your grid problems and because of the intensity of the change you're experiencing. And intense change, it means intense storms, right? And we're already feeling the storms in Texas. I feel for you all with those storms because those derechos are scary. The one we had in Iowa in 2020, it was like being in a straight line Cat 2 hurricane for about 35 minutes. And when I saw those first pictures come in from Houston this May, I thought that must have been a derecho. There's no way it wasn't a derecho. If you're making a stand in Texas, you might want to check out my reasonable prep video. I'll put that in the video description. I would want to be fully prepped and regularly maintaining and rotating supplies if I were making my stand in Texas. Because of the extent of your interlinked grid and supply chain issues, I'd probably lay in a little bit extra medical gear. In an area prone to those types of storms, I've cleaned up from a derecho too. I know there's so much debris, you need a little extra medical stuff for minor injuries. It's easy to have accidents during cleanup. I would throw some extra work gloves in the storage area if I were making my stand in Texas. If you're thinking about getting out, there are a lot of good places to go. And I think there are a lot of communities that would be glad to have you. Because when I've been through Texas, I've seen people treat each other right in Texas. I've met a lot of people who pay attention to what's going on around them. And I've seen a lot of people who have the good impulse, the impulse to help their fellow man. The reason I can show you the heat visualizations that you need to understand the level of challenge that you're facing in Texas, it's because of a volunteer in Texas. If I were in Texas, I'd think about getting out. And that's easy for me to say, you know, with my soul bound up in the land here in Iowa. It's worth noting that if things start looking real bad, it might be of interest to you. I'm going to see my patch of earth start to look a lot like Texas did back in the 90s when I was a girl. If you're making your stand in Texas, I'm going to keep you up to date. I want to give you the best information that you can, and I admire the strength of your will. So stay in touch, and let's get ready. Thanks for watching, and I want to thank everyone in the AR community for your contributions. They're keeping this nonprofit rolling and growing. If you want to donate, there's a link on the About page of our YouTube channel or on the top bar of our website, www.americanresiliency.org. I'm very grateful to our donors, to our volunteers, to everyone spreading the word online, and especially to everyone doing the work on the ground. As a special note, I'm on the lookout for a solid climate data set for Mexico. I think more and more of us are wanting a Mexico overview. If you've got a lead, email me at ar@americanresiliency.org. Thanks for getting ready with me and talk with you again soon.